Hi everyone, welcome to the Brown History Podcast. My name is Essen and this is episode 32. Today's episode is about R.B. Mori. R.B. Mori was a courageous and hardworking member of the Communist Party of India, and he was also a Dalit and played a very influential role in the Dalit movement. So you have these two separate movements happening around the same time, and R.B. Mori was the link between the two, and that was a very special and rare position to be at. Which is why his memoirs that he wrote are very important and we can learn a lot from them. We'll be speaking with Anupama Rao, who is the editor of R.B. Mori's memoir, and she has a book out called The Caste Question. So it's going to be a great episode. Before we start, I just want to announce that there's now officially a Brown History newsletter that you can sign up to. It's like the Instagram feed, except it's a place where you can have in-depth stories and stories that are too long for the Instagram posts. If you want to subscribe, just visit www.brownhistorypodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get going. Here's episode 32.
Of course, yes. Sorry, I didn't realize I'd done that, but now I will mute myself and wait.
Yeah, awesome. I have your book right here. It's a great addition to my bookshelf. But before we get started onto the life of R.B. Mori, I think we should kind of lay out the context of his world, of his background, and kind of get into that before we start talking about who he was and what his journey. So I think probably the most important vital factor in this story is the caste system. Do you want to just kind of explain what the caste system is and how it plays into his life?
Sure, Asan, and thank you for having me here. This was, and as we talk, I'll mention a little bit about how I came into this project as well, because it is I'm a historian and an anthropologist. I tend to not necessarily sort of just focus on a particular life history. And so clearly part of the question here that you're asking is, why this is interesting and important. And one of the questions you'd asked me is, why I keep talking about the caste question.
And which is the title of your last book. Yes. So what is the caste question? Yep. What is the question? Because it comes up a lot in the book.
Yes. No, and thanks so much for picking up on that. So, I was thinking a little bit about how to kind of open up and parse this question, because I think it's really at the heart of both the translation of R.B. Mori's sort of autobiography and the biography that his son writes about his entire life. But the caste question is also, as you said, sort of at the center of the work that I've been doing. So now caste itself, I think, allows us to tell the history of the subcontinent, and especially sort of modern South Asian history in quite particular ways. So I call it the political unconscious of society. What do I mean? I think caste structures our social relationships, our relationships with each other. It guides intimate relationships of marriage, who we eat with, who we sleep with. It provides sort of a structure of impunity for forms of intimate and structural violence. I think many of us have been reading about some of the really barbarous, heinous cases of Dalit women being assaulted, sexual violence and violation against Dalit women. But it's not just that. There are broader structures of violence and violation, economic discrimination, ongoing marginalization, social, political, economic. So caste sort of provides a justifying structure for all of that. Now, it also is a legal identity today, and it's a political identity. So as I said, it controls, and caste itself kind of justifies an occupational order, what you do. So I think many of us know, and we know from sort of social science, social studies classes, maybe in high school and stuff, if you say, what is caste? What people throw back at you is the textual order of caste, right? What it ought to be. And that is sort of Brahmins, ritual specialists on top, Kshatriyas, the warrior castes, right, engaged in kind of military activity, but these were also what today we call dominant castes. They control access to land, material resources, and so on. Then we've got the Vaishyas, the mercantile castes. And then you have a large swath of, and the majority, in fact, who are the Shudras, that is, the castes who perform agrarian and artisanal labor. These are your peasants, your peasant farmers. They're the ones who are barbers, they are ironsmiths, and so on. So that's kind of the way that we think about caste. But, caste has also changed a lot. So in two important moments, and then I'll let you jump in again. There were two important moments where caste really changes in quite profound ways. For me, I'm a modern historian. I study sort of the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And in this period, one important moment is colonialism, British colonialism, and the census that was put in place by British colonizers and colonial officials. And what that did was really to what we call bureaucratize caste. It made caste into a political and a social identity to the exclusion of a number of others. So if earlier you also thought of yourself as someone who lived in the Deccan, somebody who lived in Karnataka, let's say, or in South India, or in parts of the United provinces in Uttar Pradesh, what is today Uttar Pradesh, caste ends up creating a kind of homogeneous structure across India. Are you Brahmin? Are you, and so what that does is to create this as a bureaucratic identity. It enables or it entitles you to receive social entitlements from the state, early forms of what we would call affirmative action,
right,
quota systems, and so on. So that would be one important moment where caste really changed under British colonialism. The second important moment is with the Indian Constitution in India, after 1950 in particular, where certain castes, the outcasts, what today would be called the Dalits, and the scheduled tribes, Adivasis, First Peoples, are named in the Constitution as kind of subjects and objects of historical justice. Right, as people who've suffered historical discrimination. So they're named in the Constitution as being entitled to certain kinds of recognition, social policies, and so on from the state. So that's broadly speaking sort of caste and the caste question.
How does caste experiences vary from different regions? How does the politics of different regions affect caste? And I think from there we can talk about what is the connection between Bombay and Dalits and the history of Dalits, and how is the history of Bombay connected to the Dalit population?
Yeah, that's that is one can say a lot about it, but it's also the focus of my own work, because as you know, I work in Western India, and I came into the Mori book through working on the question of sort of Dalits and the transformations around the practices of untouchability in particular. And I ended up working on B.R. Ambedkar, again, a constitutionalist, considered the architect of India's constitution. Which is in many ways a radical document. How it's implemented is a different question, but it's a quite radical document. And so, in terms of how caste works regionally, now caste historically has had a link with control over land. Mm-hmm. It's related with questions of kingship, that is, people who rule people as well as populations, as well as land and territory. And so castes are distinct, are regionally distinct. Again, I hate to throw another technical term at you, but, when we think about, when I talked about the social studies, kind of understanding of caste, this would be what academics would call Varna. Varna meaning a kind of pan-Indian order, textually prescribed, right? It appears in texts. Now, as I said, caste on the ground is quite different, and it has a very complicated history. And those histories are also regional histories. And again, the technical term for that, regional castes, is called jati, which is to say caste clusters. So actually, you will find that across India, you have distinct castes that are found in particular places. You will find Gaudas, for instance, in what is today Karnataka in South India. You will find Reddis and Kammas. Again, these are dominant castes who have had a long history of controlling land and resources. You'll find Reddis and Kammas in what today would be the state of Andhra Pradesh. You will again find various quote unquote untouchable castes who are specific to certain regions. Okay, so the region that I worked in Western India had a predominance of two untouchable castes, outcasts, one called the Mangs and the other called the Mahars. And there's a kind of internal tussle between these castes as well, right? But if we start then thinking about how regional histories of caste actually generate very particular ways that we approach caste and understand caste, I could say that in the region that I work on in Western India, we see something really quite extraordinary that happens. This is a region that has a long history of anti-caste activism. That is, folks who are actively challenging this complicated caste order that I've been talking about, political, economic, social, legal, existential. It's about who you are, what you do, who you eat, who you sleep with. And we have a very long history, and in the modern period, certainly across the 19th and the 20th centuries, we have people who are making a push for radical equality. That is to say, we are against caste hierarchy. We refuse social distinctions of caste. And we want to think about equality and democracy. But like in any place, so think about the question, think about race in the US, right? The only way you can imagine substantive equality in the United States is to get at the question of both immigration and then the question of race and racism. So every imagination of equality actually demands that you understand inequality, right? And so caste becomes that form of inequality, right? And difference that has to be addressed if you're going to think about democratic equality in a kind of modern framework. So my own work, until I focused on R.B. Mori and worked with a good friend and a colleague who translated R.B. Mori's autobiography, I've been looking at the work of B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar, again, interesting figure. He studied at my university. He was at Columbia University from 1913 to 1916. He then went and studied at the London School of Economics. Probably in late colonial India, the most educated, the most decorated, you might say, activist, anti-colonial and radical thinker that we have had for colonial and late colonial India.
Yeah.
And my work, in the caste question was actually focused on thinking about the movement he led for Dalit rights.
Yeah.
And Ambedkar's argument, again, like African-American political thinkers and philosophers, is we think the problem of equality from the very bottom up. If the outcast can't find equality, can't find equal recognition, cannot find civil and political rights, then democracy is meaningless, right? So you think from the bottom, you think from the position of the most subaltern, the most destituted, the most marginalized of the social order, in order to think most substantively of what equality should be. And so the caste question for me, and I think you had sort of said, why do you keep calling this the caste question? The caste question for me is therefore really the fundamental question of how we understand modern India today. Without understanding this long, complicated history of caste and the way that caste has enabled social movements for equality and redress against historical discrimination, we actually can't understand our modern political, social, and economic life, right? So when I call it the caste question, I was drawing, it's a question that has no resolution. There is no answer to this, right? Yeah. Caste morphs as social conditions morph. It's like saying, there's no end to racism right? Racism transforms. It's different in Jim Crow. It's different post 1965. It exists with Black lives and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
But racism, the ways in which our social relationships with each other lead to practices of prejudice, of exclusion, of non-recognition, those continue. And we're all very smart. The social order is very smart in reproducing these forms and practices of exclusion. So when I call it the caste question, it's actually addressing this issue. There's no final question, answer to this question. The question keeps being framed again and again and again. It's like the woman's question. Or for me, when I wrote the caste question, I was very influenced actually by Marx's Jewish question. It's a text that is written in 1843, and it is published in 1844. Mm-hmm. And there Marx asks this question of how do we deal with religious differences in a modern order where everybody is presumed to be equal? What mechanisms do we have to recognize difference when we're all supposed to be equal to each other? And he comes up with a quite interesting, and again, I have a kind of critique and an engagement with it. But the argument there that he poses is, what do we do with social difference, people who are different, but who claim equality? The woman question is the same thing, right? Recognize my difference, recognize that I have been excluded because I am seen to be different. But let's find ways in which I am rendered equal to you. Mm-hmm. So it's this kind of it's called a paradox, a contradiction, a conundrum, a dilemma. How does an order that thinks about equality address the question of difference? And caste in India became a kind of fundamental form of difference, but also of social inequality.
Yeah. It was Bombay the hub of the anti-caste movements at the time, because R.B. Mori goes to Bombay, and that's where most of his life is spent and most of his activism is. So in regards to that, how is the history of Bombay connected with the Dalit community?
Sure. Bombay, in Western India, there are many places what today we would consider even, small villages and so on that had very radical pasts of anti-caste activism. Okay. But Bombay indeed becomes very important, not just for South Asia. It was probably the most important port city for the British, right? The British Empire. Now, the history of Bombay is really interesting. It's again connected with the history of the United States. Modern Bombay rises in the context of the American Civil War and the blockade on cotton in the South. And this is the period that we see Bombay coming into its own. And so the cotton economy, which connects kind of, the British, the America, North America and India, is part and parcel of why Bombay becomes so important. But Bombay in the 19th century into the 20th century was a place where there were a lot of what we might call indigenous capitalists, right? Not just British bringing money in, pumping money into the empire, but we have Parsis, we have people from various Gujarati communities, Hindu and Muslim, who have long histories of trade, of engaging in trade across the Indian Ocean and so on. And from all of them, Bombay is a kind of hub. So
where the money is, basically.
Where the money is, absolutely, right? So Bombay becomes a city of money and machines, okay? Mm-hmm. New machines, that is, the railways are very crucial for Bombay, but also many other colonial cities, trams, the world of kind of electricity and lights and so on. So Bombay really was a modern industrial hub. It was an industrializing center when R.B. Mori comes to this place. I can say a bit about R.B. Mori, but I thought I could read a bit for you as well in his own words. Tell me when.
Yeah, now would be a good time. So who is R.B. Mori, and why should we care what he's done, what he's up to, basically, and maybe talk about his upbringing. What formed him to be who he is, and Take it away.
Yeah. No, thank you. I read, and I'll say a little bit about how I came to work on R.B. Mori and what makes him interesting, both in terms of his own life, but also what we ended up doing with translating his autobiography and writing a kind of introduction to his world and his life. I read R.B. Mori's autobiography in Marathi when I was working on my book, which was published in 2009, The Caste Question. And I found this book fascinating. And this is because it's a work, even in Marathi, it's a two-part work. There is his autobiography, and then his son writes his father's life.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a good friend of his grandson, Subodh Mori. And it was that world of kind of, intellectual life and engaging with people when I was doing my own research in Bombay that brought R.B. Mori's work to my attention.
Right.
It's a rare autobiography. We have few autobiographies of the sort that we find for R.B. Mori and his life. He was very, very active in the Dalit movement, the early Dalit movement, the early Ambedkar movement. He was a very important colleague of Ambedkar's. And then in 1930, he becomes a card-carrying member of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And embraces another idea of equality. And I thought actually this connection and contradiction between somebody who was both an Ambedkarite, very interested in the caste question, and then started taking up the question of class, and became a communist, but always in a very deep tension with the Communist Party and communist politics also, because they refused to engage the question of caste.
We'll get into that after.
He fought from within, right? So that's what made this autobiography cum biography really interesting to me. He's born in 1903. He dies in 1972. He was urged just before he passed away to write his autobiography. The autobiography ends in 1924, and it ends right on the cusp of the first major civil rights struggle that's undertaken by Ambedkar, which is the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927, which lays claim to civil rights, the right to take water from a public tank.
We'll talk about that after too.
Yep. And so this is, so the life sort of ends, actually just as things are getting going on the ground.
Right.
And then his son kind of, completes his life. This is a red family across 3 generations. And I thought that was really interesting. So when we started sort of translating the work, I was thinking about this, and you've talked about the world of Bombay. I was really thinking about the ways in which the autobiography reflects and opens up access to kind of the world of urban subalterns in a way that we don't have access to for the early part of the 20th century. And that's what makes this work so interesting and rare and really sort of precious to me. And it's also the kind of language that Mori uses. I've called him in the book, in my introduction, I've called him a kind of urban dandy, by which I mean
urban dandy.
Yes,
and
a flaneur, right? And this is a term that's drawn from Walter Benjamin, who talks about the ways in which the 19th century cities, he's thinking about Paris in particular, but we could think about Bombay too, that the city was leading to a kind of radical opening, newness of social possibilities. What does someone like Benjamin have in mind? What did I have in mind? Well, the urban space allows you to traverse social differences. It allows you to move across neighborhoods. Trams, trains, buses are permitting movement across social classes, across social distinctions, right? And Mori totally embraces this. And one of the things that I'm arguing is that the city makes the man, if you will, as much as the man brings a very new understanding to the city. Dalits who moved, he's part of a movement, a broader movement of Dalits who came to the city. there's a 66% rise of outcast communities of different untouchable castes who come, largely Mahar though, who come to Bombay from the surrounding regions.
Mm-hmm.
They are the ones who are involved in what we would call sort of public works. That is, they're sanitation workers, they're conductors on trams and trains, they're working as railway workers.
So there's a lot of opportunity financially for Dalits coming in from around India.
There is. And so they experience the city as a place of new possibility, but the city also becomes a place of new forms of spatial segregation. So that's kind of, why Mori's, rare autobiography also gives us a sense of this experience of the city as kind of Janus-faced, if you will, right? It's opening up these possibilities, but it's also making you very aware in new ways about being an untouchable, about being an outcast. So that's kind of what I was trying to draw attention to.
So you have Bombay, which is kind of this rising city with lots of money and financial opportunity and any dreams. It's like the American dream, like anything's possible.
Yes.
And then you have this movement that are people fighting against caste and against caste discrimination. But you also have another movement happening around the same time, which is the Communist Party. What's going on with that, and what role are they playing in Bombay, and what do they want, and what are the things that they are doing after this? I want to talk about how they're connected, but right now I want to kind of define each one on its own.
Sure. So we've talked about sort of the Ambedkar movement and this long history for working for caste rights. Now, the communist movement, again, Bombay, because it was a city not just of money and opportunity, but it was an industrializing center. So it's a city of labor as well as capital. Right. So most of the people coming into the city now, and the textile mills, we haven't talked about the textile mills as well, together with the railways and the textile mills are very significant, right? So from the 1850s onwards, many of these indigenous capitalists that I spoke about, they're plunking their money into textile mills and textile production. So Bombay was part of a kind of, very important, second order economy, industrializing economy, where textile mills were the kind of primary, not just industries, but they transformed the city, the urban landscape. Because life was organized, especially in the urban areas of Bombay, what today would be called South Bombay, you would have the textile mills, the architecture of the mill, and then the places around the mills, chawls, tenements, where mill labor lived. This is the architecture of the changing city. Right? You can think about, London and industrializing London. You could think about Paris also as a city of labor. So all of these industrial areas. And so communism and a certain branch or a brand, you could say, of kind of Indian communism is very drawn to Bombay. This is where the workers are. This is where you're going to mobilize them and say, listen, think about labor and exploitation. And the Indian Communist Party had actually been formed in Tashkent, in Eurasia, in what would be the broader Soviet Union in 1924-25. And for Indian communism, Bombay, Madras in the south, also another major textile area, and then Kanpur in North India, which also had important leather works, would be three important areas for communist organizing. And a lot of the major British communists, Philip Spratt and others, would come to Bombay because they saw this as a place for recruiting members of the Communist Party. And you also have a number of South Asians in Bombay who are very drawn to communism. This is where the interesting contradictions also come in. Ambedkar, for instance, who has a very interesting relationship, awkward, complicated. He is sometimes organizing with the communists and the members of the Workers' and Peasants' Party. And at other times, and largely, he calls the Indian communists a bunch of Brahmin boys because most of them were upper caste.
Okay.
They're the ones who are the theoreticians of the party.
I see.
R.B. Mori is a kind of foot soldier, but Mori is the one after 1930 who's working with construction workers. He is bringing in he's working with municipal workers. And he's the one who's creating links between outcast communities, the laboring castes, and an imagination of communism as a new utopia. So it's a very complicated and unresolved history. Again, think about what's happening in the US in the 1920s and the 30s with Black Marxism and Black communists. And you keep it, and please remember that, someone like Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, written in 1935, talks about the white and the Black proletariat. And his imagination, his utopia, is how can we bring these folks together? What we know is that white workers did not embrace the Black proletariat, right? And they embrace instead their whiteness, which Du Bois calls a psychological wage. It's something that allows you to feel socially superior, even if you're working alongside. And this is like caste in India.
This was the pretty much similar to what was going on with the Communism Party. Same concept, same issues.
Yeah, you could use the analogy, I think. Yes, very well.
Okay.
Very well.
Because I know that I read in the book that Ambedkar didn't want to work with anybody that felt any pity towards caste. Absolutely. What does he mean by that? And can what does that mean? Because I think that's really interesting, and I want people to hear that.
Yes. Ambedkar, unlike Gandhi, so when you talk about pity, the person that we immediately think about is Gandhi, who perhaps has, and we know his name, he's kind of globally seen as important in terms of his understanding of nonviolence and so on. And Gandhi, amongst the upper caste sort of reformers, was most engaged with the question of untouchability. But he also renames the outcast communities as Harijans, right? That is people of God. Mm-hmm. And he wants to keep them within Hinduism. And when Ambedkar is talking about pity and the condescension of the upper castes, he very largely, especially in the 1930s and after, has in mind someone like Gandhi. Gandhi says at some point, I within myself can represent the untouchables. Ambedkar's is a resolute no, and it is an argument about self-respect, about dignity, and about remaking your community on your terms, demanding political rights and equal recognition, not to play a subsidiary role within Hinduism. So this becomes really, really interesting. And, that's why I said, caste itself is so complicated, right? It has a religious basis, it's economic, and it's a number of other things. And this is why in 1956, shortly before he passes away, Ambedkar also converts out of Hinduism into Buddhism. So the pity question is also a question of what is the relationship between outcasts, caste, and Hinduism? And second, the political question. Do we struggle on our own terms for political, economic rights and for social dignity and equal participation? Or do we get folded into a pity party, if you will? Yeah. And are we going to be condescended to by somebody who, yes, is extremely radical? I think, Gandhi was very radical on the question of caste, but he faces his limit.
Right.
He's representing someone else. Ambedkar says we need to represent ourselves. And this is why he is such an extraordinary figure in the history of global thinking about radical democracy. Okay. And this I want everybody to hear as well.
That is amazing. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Can I read a couple of
Sure, of course.
Do you mind?
Listen, no, not at all.
To get a sense of, it speaks to so many of these wonderful questions that you've been asking about, who is Mori and how does he experience the city? So let me just read a couple of things in his own words. Is that okay? From the introduction?
Yeah. Just give us some context of the passage you're reading, and then take it away.
Yep. So, and a couple of really interesting things. So Mori, when he's a child is and I was also very drawn to this when I was reading his book in Marathi, and I came across something that is rather extraordinary, and I think again people want to hear about. He is a child who comes into learning. He goes to school, and he goes to take exams for higher education, for higher learning. And you were supposed to go, and the Bombay government administered these exams in Alibag, which today is a kind of, resort for the rich and the famous. It's right outside of Bombay. You take a ferry and go there. And he writes about the fact that as an untouchable student, he could not sit with the other students in the classroom to take this exam. He sits outside the classroom. The papers are flung at him because you're not supposed to touch an untouchable, right?
Terrible.
Untouchable.
Yeah.
And he sits outside, and he sits and he takes this exam, and he comes in first.
Wow.
He becomes the scholarship student for the Bombay government. And then he is a young man. This is, he's 10, between 10 and 12 or thereabouts. The local school won't allow him in, even though he is a scholarship student, in order to continue his learning. And he writes a lot about what it means for him to sit outside the classroom and study. And that's how he learns. That's how he learns both English and Marathi. And then at some point, he talks about coming to Bombay for the first time. And I thought I would read from this. He comes to Bombay initially en route to Alibag with an uncle to take those exams, where, he becomes a scholarship student who can't enter the classroom. Let me read out just a couple of things from there, and I'll mention a few things where he really gives us a feeling about what Bombay was like at the time. So in describing this first visit to Bombay at the age of 11, R.B. Mori says, "For the first time in my life, I saw railway trains, motorboats, brightly shining electric lights in buildings and on the roads, cars, horse carriages, the rattling of trams, the sirens of ships and the textile factories, people wearing all kinds of different costumes, enormous hotels and restaurants serving drinks and food, bars for alcoholic drinks and toddy, markets selling fish, meat, vegetables, and flowers, shops and markets selling clothes, shops selling silver and gold. I had this chance to see Bombay because I had come for the examination in Alibag." Later on, he talks about, and this might also again be important to your point, Asan, about how did the Communist Party react or respond to its lower level cadre?
Yeah.
Okay. And let me read this out. And this is, he's much older. He's actually underground. He's a member of the Communist Party. The party was banned by the British. It was seen to be treasonous. It challenged the sovereignty of the Queen, who was also, quote unquote, King Emperor, interestingly. And so he's underground. And let me read this out to you. This is from much later in his life. And the son, R.B. Mori's son, Satyendra Mori, is a child and records an especially poignant account of his family that's been thrown out of their home, sitting under Elphinstone Bridge with all their belongings because they have been evicted because they couldn't pay their rent. Here is this section. "The upper caste leadership of the Communist Party chances upon on this family in this desperate situation." And I'm quoting from R.B. Mori here in the translation. D.S. Vaidya, one of the members of the party, the central command, you could say, asked me, Datta Kelkar, another upper caste member of the CP, the Communist Party, "Isn't that woman sitting under the bridge the wife of R.B. Mori? I know R.B. Mori very well, but I had never met his wife or seen her. Several beggars used to take shelter under that bridge. Why should R.B. Mori's wife be sitting there?" As I was thinking thus, Vaidya called out in a concerned voice, "Hey, it's her, it's she." We both approached her. Next to her, there were 2 or 3 tin boxes, a sack with cooking pots, and a little boy. The lady told us we had not paid the rent, had we? So the bailiff from the court threw us out. My husband has now gone to look for another room. Until then, I will wait here. Vaidya could not hide the tears that came into his eyes. Again, gives you a sense of the life of penury, of kind of destitution that Mori embraces for the life of the party. But I think this is also such a telling example of that contradiction. The Brahmin boys who had the party
Yeah.
and cater, because these folks come and R.B. Mori's family, because of his sacrifices for the party, experienced this kind of homelessness many times. This is not the only time. And so you begin to get a sense of the city, right? The city is, glamorous, it's open, there's all kinds of possibilities, there's newness that Mori as a kid experiences. But his family and his child who's writing about this are also experiencing extreme destitution, deep privation, because of the father's political choices. And because he is someone who's not, who's not a kind of party high command. So the family embraces this kind of homelessness. It embraces the fact that, the father is underground. And I think this gives you a sense of also the contradictions about caste and class at this time. And, I leave it there. There's lots else in this autobiography and the kinds of descriptions. He talks about, how he would go and find work in the docks.
Mm-hmm.
He would be a daily wage worker. If you stood in the docks, even if they didn't give you a job, they gave you a few paisa, and he would do that. He works as a porter. R.B. Mori, when he's young, writes about sleeping in parks because he's homeless. Writes about, going into restaurants and eating and running away before they can, be asked to pay. So that's what I meant also by this idea of the urban dandy. The city suddenly opens up all these possibilities. And Mori is meeting all kinds of people. And I think that's how he also comes into communist politics.
Right. Before he joins the communist politics, what role did he play in the struggle against caste? I know that we can talk about, an example is the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927. Can you elaborate on what that is and what his role was in all this? And then we can talk about his role in the Communist Party after.
Yes, sure. So, from the time he's a young child, R.B. Mori, when he's living in a place in the Konkan, just outside of Bombay, where many Dalit workers came from. Because he's one of the few people in his community who can read and write, from early on, he talks about, and this is as like a young person, 10, 11, 12 years old, Dalits would come in, and near the bus station and so on, they wouldn't be allowed to take water. They couldn't find sources. So he actually sets up like a little hotel near the bus stand. This is a young, this is like a child, right?
Wow.
And he says, hey, listen, our people they're not even given water when they come in. They can't go into a hotel and ask for water. They're, drinking from separate cups. We know that exists to this day and so on. So he has been quite the activist. And in fact, R.B. Mori in the Konkan had taken on a kind of civil rights satyagraha, laying claim to a public water tank, which becomes the kind of prehistory to the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927. And he played a very, very big role in the Mahad Satyagraha. He wanted, and in 24-25, the colonial government opens public resources like tanks and other spaces to all the castes. And they do this sort of saying that, people, these are public goods. We should embrace public access. And the Mahad Satyagraha itself and cases earlier, they become like a kind of test case where you go in and you say, these places have been opened up. Let's go and see if we can actually take access, to or lay claim to public access to these tanks. So the Mahad Satyagraha in 27 happens in March and again in December. And Mahad is a small town in the Konkan. There is this public water source, but it's right next to a temple.
Mm-hmm.
And Ambedkar goes, and there's a huge movement mobilizing Dalits. And this was also seen as a way of making Dalits conscious of their rights. So think of this almost like a Rosa Parks, it's very much like a sit-in, right?
Yeah.
Let's actually do this to bring our community together and to create a kind of political identity for them.
Yeah.
So when Ambedkar goes the first time, he is egged on and he's really encouraged by R.B. More to come in. And then others, there's A.V. Chitre and a couple of other local supporters. These were upper caste supporters of the Ambedkar movement, the early Dalit movement and the Ambedkar movement. He is brought in to Mahad, and Ambedkar goes with a group of Dalit, and it's a multi-caste group actually, social activists, who go in and take water from the tank. Almost immediately they're attacked. A cry goes around Mahad that the tank has been fouled, quote unquote, because untouchables have come in and they've touched the water.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a scuffle, there's violence against the people who've gone in to take water from the tank, and they have to disperse. And the upper castes in the town go in and sanctify the Mahad tank with urine and cow dung. Okay, that's what happens in March. And because this happens, there's a case that's filed in court. Ambedkar actually is involved in that legal case. He's a lawyer, don't forget, and an important constitutionalist later. He's trained as a lawyer. And then in December, he goes back with a larger group. And at this point, they do something even more incendiary, insurgent, and radical. And he's actually egged on again by this multi-caste group of activists that stand behind him, including somebody called Sahasrabuddhe, who's a Brahmin actually. And he's encouraged to not just take water and to go back and say, here we are again, you try to get rid of us, no way. But the Manusmriti, the so-called, text of ethics and law, of Hindu law, is publicly burnt. And Ambedkar basically is saying, I reject the entire order of caste, which is given a kind of legal life by the Manusmriti. So that's the Mahad Satyagraha. Wow. And Mori is behind all of this.
So then, so then Mori, okay, so let's just recap. There's two movements. There's the Dalit struggle, and then there's the Communist Party. They both have to get, between each other, they both have this complicated relationship, but R.B. Mori decides to join the Communist Party. Now, how does R.B. Mori navigate through the Communist Party when it's a movement that doesn't really give the caste question? The caste question isn't really a primary concern of the Communist Party. So what changes what he tries to do in the Communist Party, and does this affect his relationship with Ambedkar and his movements? Does it, or does he try to balance both, or does he do a good job? There's a lot of questions in here. Sorry.
No. He, I think you've kind of really gotten to the nub of this contradiction, right? For somebody who is so far-seeing, is working on behalf of his community, why does he move into communism? Why does he become a card-carrying member of the party? And, you can never really get at, people's psyches and kind of, why they do what they do. Mm-hmm. What he says at the time is that he wants to think about the question of equality and of human emancipation and so on, which communism opens up and makes possible. And he writes himself, and his son, who writes the biography of Mori's life, which ends, as I said, in 24, basically writes that, he goes and meets Ambedkar. In fact, Mori was involved and was a kind of lieutenant and was a major editor of Bahishkrit Bharat, the outcast or the boycotted India, which is also one of Ambedkar's early and major sort of newspapers. And Satyendra Mori, the son, as well as R.B. Mori, tell us that Mori goes to Ambedkar and talks to him about having made this decision, and that Ambedkar sort of, understands why he would do this. What we see for the rest of R.B. Mori's life is that his focus is on untouchable laborers, construction labor, what we would think of as like precarious labor, construction labor, municipal workers, quote unquote scavengers, right, who are performing various kinds of social hygiene, if you will, for the city, right? They're the ones removing excreta and wastes and so on, that he becomes very involved with them.
Yeah.
And his focus always within the party is to keep telling the party, listen, you're not paying attention to the question of caste on its own terms. And so he becomes, and that's why, again, to your question, what was so interesting about this person? This is one of the rare autobiographies that gives some hint of how somebody is trying to navigate two ideas of human equality, two ideas of human emancipation. But those two ideas on the ground have a very complicated political and social relationship, right?
Right.
They almost seem to be at odds with each other. He, navigates, and he keeps bringing up the caste question throughout in the Communist Party.
Do they listen?
Off and on, they do. But I think we also see many instances like the one that I read to you. That's why I wanted to read that question, that small anecdote of being sort of set out on the bridge and so on. I think there is a way in which the existential life world of being untouchable, of being lower caste, of being downtrodden, marginalized, destituted, that the Communist Party doesn't quite address that. They're theoretically thinking about how caste, which was seen as a kind of backward category, it's not modern, how they could modernize caste. The understanding of modernizing caste is to make it class. Mm-hmm. Listen, we don't, you may be Muslim, you may be untouchable, you may be coming from one of the Bahujan castes, right? The quote unquote Shudra castes and so on. But you leave that identity at home because you come into the workplace and we're all workers. We're all laborers. Yeah. And what do? We have strike action. We have garao. We surround, mill owners and so on and demand our rights. And Bombay was a very radical, militant working class city, right? And one of the things that I also sort of try to bring out in my introduction to the translated autobiography and biography is to say that it is the question of caste and caste labor and untouchable workers and Bahujan labor and so on that actually inspires the political thinking of Marxism. So I want to say this is a kind of forgotten history of the communist movement that's not even embraced by the movement itself, except in bibs and bobs here and there.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. But again, your question, earlier you asked about regional histories in Telangana, in what is today Andhra Pradesh. In South India, there are pockets where you had people like R.B. Mori who were able to combine the question of caste and class and really bring them to the fore. Landless laborers, peasant agricultural workers who were involved in really major struggles for wages, for transforming feudal relationships in the countryside and so on. So we do have those histories as well. It's a very complicated history of caste and class, but also the kind of forgotten histories of the Communist Party. So, this is part of the caste class relationships on the ground. This is part of the kind of secret, the fugitive, the forgotten history, I think, of the Communist Party. And it's very contentious today because staunch Ambedkarites feel that communists were opportunistic in taking up the caste question. They did it when it served their interests, but they did not understand the life world of the untouchables, right? Yeah. And so it's become a very complicated issue today to even put forward this idea that there is this kind of Dalit communist whose utopias are around labor and they're around the body and untouchability and caste. So it's also like a kind of forgotten moment that, we want to, or I would like to kind of think about, not with any, like the caste question, there's no answer to this. You don't come out on one side or the other. You don't say, well, the Ambedkarites were right, the communists were absolutely wrong. The communists were right. I would probably stand on the side of the Ambedkarites because they had a much more rich and grounded and kind of profound understanding of what it means to imagine equality in a caste stratified society like India. Whereas in many ways, the communists are bringing in, and this was also always the argument, they're bringing in an idea that comes from somewhere else, right? How do they make it Indian? How do you know what is the history of Indian communism and so on? So lots of questions. And Asan, to also your point about, it's not just about caste and about Dalits in the party. It's also about the history of Islam and of Muslim communists who were very, very important in the Communist Party of India, including in Bombay. And they
How?
also face this.
What was their role in the Communist Party?
Oh, I mean, they're very, very important. I mean, in places like East India and Bengal and so on, Muzaffar Ahmed, some of the early Marxists, I won't even call them, this is a moment when sort of the idea of Marxism is becoming institutionalized as an idea of the party.
Mm-hmm.
And Muslim Marxists were deeply involved in the party. I also think that, like someone like R.B. Mori, they bring with them a much more nuanced, vernacular, rich, life world experience-oriented understanding of what Marxism could become and what communism could be in India. Many of them are channeling ideas from Islam of ethical behavior, of equality, of forgetting about distinctions of caste, of remaking new notions, new ideas, I should say, of community. But they're also channeling ideas drawn, as I said, from Islam, from other heterodox, what we would today think of as kind of religious ideas. They're infusing this early thinking of equality with those ideas. And that's why it's so complicated. It's so complicated. And that's why I say I probably stand on the side of the Ambedkarites in how you come into communism, rather than coming from communism and trying to think about what we do with caste.
A lot of the issues during R.B. Mori's life still exist today. What do you think we could learn from his life, from his autobiography in today's day and age?
I think the autobiography of someone like R.B. Mori, and also his son and his grandson, as I said, who's a good friend of mine, who was deeply involved. I mean, I thought about translating this with a friend of mine and a colleague, Vandana Sonalkar, who actually did the translation of the biography, the autobiography, because I knew Mori's grandson. And he introduced me to this life world of Bombay, and we would go out, and he introduced me to journals from the time and so on. So he is as much not just a collaborator, he is like a co-traveler in every sense in this book. And I think what we see here is an individual's struggle to lead a politically meaningful, ethical life, and how much he was connected with his community. He lives always, as I've mentioned, he's always living on the edge. The family moved to Goregaon just before he passed away, and they got something like a 220 square foot sort of built up home, a kind of formal house. This is not anything. So this is somebody who also embraces that kind of austerity, who completely gives himself up for his community. And it's, I think we have to learn from this, because it gives us a sense of who we could be in terms of our better selves. Mm-hmm. And it gives us a sense of what it means to completely involve yourself in the life of a community and to bring about change from within. He's dealing with people who don't know how to read. One of the most important ideologues, quote unquote, of the movement, who was discovered by R.B. Mori, is someone called Anupama Rao. He was a performer in the Communist Party. That is to say, they performed, music.
Street plays. Music. Street plays and music.
Music, most importantly, right? Anupama Rao was a construction worker, came into Bombay, is discovered and is organized by R.B. Mori. The story goes that Anupama Rao, who is completely illiterate, learned to read by reading the advertisements around him in Bombay.
Wow.
Extraordinary voice. He's the one who brings the music of the movement out. So Mori's life also tells us that, the people who actually populated the movement, who gave it what I will call a kind of poetry, poetic speech, sound, song, brought in people who were unlettered. They were not illiterate, they were unlettered. But these were people who actually had the experience of exploitation. They had the understanding of exclusion, of destitution. And this is somebody who's kind of giving that community voice, right? And he is representing them. Again, to your question about Ambedkar, pity and condescension, you represent yourself. We're fellow travelers. We provide, solidarity. We commemorate that history. We remember it and make sure that it's not forgotten. And I think that's maybe the role of like an academic like myself, an upper caste academic like myself, I should say.
Awesome. This was I think that's all the time we have, and this was a great episode. Is there anything you want to add in? Do you want to talk about anything you want, future projects?
No.
No?
I would like to, I
You
go
want to
with
add in something?
I just want to, mention or highlight the kind of radical histories of caste that we inherit on the subcontinent.
Mhm.
The importance of going back and reading someone like Ambedkar, who's a complicated thinker. He's not just a movement activist, but he's a very complicated thinker, contradictory, we have to historicize his thought and so on. The third is for me that this interwar period in the 20th century was a period of a lot of opening, where these kinds of ideas could collide, radical anti-caste ideas, communism, and so on. We're in such a different moment today.
Yeah.
Many people are challenging the history of, civil rights. Many of us are ourselves historical beings, right? When I teach students, most of them have grown up after, 2001 and the war on terror. They live and they've grown up as American students in a period of permanent war, right? And I will make a kind of plug also for doing a certain kind of history, doing a certain kind of anthropology, that, our work has some value if we can open up other ways of thinking, other ways of being, and maybe other ways of challenging this really, I think, despairing present that we seem to be in politically too, and to
Right.
create, to think about new kinds of solidarity. And I think that's really about it.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. I'll let you know when this is released, probably very soon this week.